Hi guys! People in US are complaining about crazy inflation and Democrats who printed out too much money and now all the prices went up. Joe Biden assured us that it's all temporary because of shortages in supply chain and the global economy needs to recover after the COVID. As an investor in the US stock market, I take all those claims very seriously. And I'm not a big fan of Joe Biden and all those stimulus checks, but we need to follow the fact not to follow our biases. The way US dollar is supposed to work as a currency is that every year you will have some inflation from 2 to 3%. Let's say we have an apple which cost $1 this year and the next year it's supposed to cost like $1.02. Basically, US government wants people to spend or invest their money and not to store them on their bank accounts because this slows down the economy. Another good thing is that your salary is supposed to grow every year by some small amounts to compensate for the inflation, which can give you some kind of a psychological satisfaction. And to be clear, not every country does this. For example, Switzerland has a goal of 0% inflation for their currency. Sometimes the prices are going up or down independent of the inflation. For example, we have a terrible weather this year and the apples suddenly cost twice as much as they cost 2 years ago. So it can be quite challenging to define what exactly is inflation. Government tries to average price changes across different essential items, so-called consumer basket. The recently published stats from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that the average inflation in US is 5.4% over the last 12 months, which is way about 2 or 3%, and it sounds alarming. But what about last 24 months? This could be a little bit more precise because then we can measure pre-pandemic with post-pandemic prices. We can check the same stats from the June 2020 and see that inflation back then was 0.6%. After very simple math, we can say that inflation over the last 24 months was 6%, which is only 3% per year, and this is not alarming at all. Now let's look at some specific items. For example, gasoline went up to 44%. That's definitely a lot. But if we compare it with June 2020 inflation, we can see that the price back then went down by 22%. Again, with a simple math, we can say that there was 11% inflation over 2 years, which is not that terribly bad. As you know, the gas prices are directly correlated with the crude oil prices. What I find extremely interesting, if you compare the prices of the crude oil over the last 3 years with the prices at the gas in US, you can see that the prices of the crude oil were actually higher than they are right now, but the price at the pump was 10% lower, which actually proves that there is a huge supply problem for the gas in US, and the prices eventually will cool down. Next things are cars. New cars went up to 5.3% within the last 12 months. But again, if you check the previous year, you can see that back then there was a 0.2% of reduction, which makes a perfect 2.5% of inflation per year. The biggest puzzle here are used car, which went up to 44% this year. And if you look at the last year, there was a tiny reduction of 2.8%, which doesn't compensate much. If you listen to Uncle Joe, you can hear that there is a shortage of semiconductors in China, and that's why they cannot build any new cars, and that's why people are buying the old ones, and that's why the demand is increased by 3 times. My guess is different. US historically had the lowest price for the used cars across the globe. The reason for that is that the majority of Americans prefer to buy new cars with the financial loans. Basically, a typical American buys a new car which on average costs like 35 grand and then pays for it for the next 5 to 6 years. When you get bored with the car, you can sell it and buy a new one using the same scheme. When I lived in California, I was really amazed how people working at Starbucks or McDonald's were buying cars for 30 grand, which is technically a little bit more than they earn for the whole year. And people who work at Google, like myself, and earn probably at least 5 times more than they, were just buying some used cars for, let's say, 9 grand just in cash. Doesn't make much sense, right? So I asked some of my Starbucks barista friends, why do they need a new car? And the answer was that they have to have a super reliable car because they have to drive from home to work, and if they miss their work, they're gonna be fired, and it's a big issue. And obviously there is no any good public transport or Uber in the area where they live. If you work for Google in Silicon Valley, it's not really a problem for you because you actually have some shuttle bus from your home to the office and you can spend 2 or 3 days working at home and it's kind of okay. My guess that during the pandemic era, people and companies realized that actually workers can work remotely pretty efficiently. So you don't have to have super reliable car any longer, and that's why the demand for the used cars increased by 3 times. If what I've just said is true, the prices will stay like this forever, but still I would not call this an inflation, it's just a change of the market. The last thing we need to do to prove that there is no crazy inflation of US dollars is to check it against different currency, for example, Swiss franc. We know that Swiss franc is a super stable currency and Swiss government didn't give any stimulus checks to their people and it's not as crazy as Joe Biden. If you look at the exchange rate over the last 2 years, you can see that US dollar lost 7% of its value, which is slightly more than expected 6%. But bear in mind that there is a volatility there and you have like 1 to 2% this way or that way. The point is that US dollar doesn't experience any crazy inflation, at least right now. Now you might ask me, we learned in a school and university that if you print more and more money, you will create a more supply, and this definitely should cause the inflation. There are many examples across the world, like Venezuela, when the currency can lose 50% of its value over the course of 1 month. So why US is so different? Well, the truth is that US doesn't print any money. Instead, it sells its debt to domestic or foreign investors. The debt which can be sold has a very fancy name called bond. For example, let's say US issues a $10,000 bond for the 10 years and 1% rate. This means that the buyer pays $10,000 to the US government and then he or she gets 1%, which is $100 every year for the next 10 years. And then at the end of 10 years, the government pays back this $10,000. The rate which government pays you every year is actually really small. For example, today it's just only 1.2%. And none of the sane investor would do this because the rate of return is lower than the inflation rate. However, there is one very interesting property of that bond. It actually works like cash. If you need to pay someone $10,000, you can just simply transfer a US bond worth of $10,000 to that person. Now you might say, why would you do this if you can just simply do a bank transfer? Well, bank transfers works well only when your quote is relatively small and your transfer is domestic. Imagine if you want to transfer 10 millions from US to China. You cannot really do this through the bank accounts out of simple change in their account tables because US banks doesn't really trust China bank and vice versa. So in the real life, to make this transfer happen, US bank needs to bring a bunch of gold to China bank, which is very inconvenient and it cannot be done within seconds. Imagine that instead of this bank transfer, you can just simply change the ownership of the bond from US to China customer. This can be done within seconds, and US and China customers actually trust the US federal government because of their past history and the stability of the US dollar. Therefore, you have lots of international folks, especially in China, who are interested in using US federal bonds as an intermediary payment. 60% of these bonds are coming from United States government, which gives America a huge advantage. Basically, as soon as one of your bond expires and you have to pay the money back, you can issue another new bond and pay with this money for the old one, simply because you have a huge international demand. Just an interesting note, if you remember the crisis of 2008, one of the mechanical reasons for that was that US haven't issued enough of these federal bonds and countries like China and other Asian countries had a huge demand for them. And some clever capitalists in US created a schema to issue a new bonds on the people's mortgages. And as you know, it didn't end up super well. The long story short is that the world demands lots of US federal bonds. And there is nothing wrong that US national debt is growing along with the world economy. This debt is de facto a free money for US people, and it's not really intended to be paid back. Basically, every American got $1,200 check and the whole world paid for this. But in the same time, this allowed this whole world to develop faster. So it's kind of a win-win situation. Obviously, the bigger win is in America. The only thing which worries me is that US debt will grow exponentially because of some crazy Joe Biden policies, and then US will end up like Venezuela. But currently, it's really far away from the reality. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time, bye!